My name is Tara Anderson, and it is my honor to be working with my dear friend, Dr. Jay Taksony Hewitt, to co-create with you our worship service. Jay is a member, has been a member here since COVID, and is a frequent speaker in our pulpit, holding both a Master of Divinity and a Doctorate of Ministry, as well as a hands full of other degrees in theology and world religion. Jay always brings us interesting history and explorations of the spiritual traditions that inform our UU path. They have also been my beloved teacher these many years, slowly and gently, always encouraging me to see my own prejudices and ignorance. I am learning to change my reaction to people that I experience differently. Jay is teaching me to notice the circle I draw, how my circle is smaller than my values would suggest I would have. I'm learning to notice my own discomfort, to lean into it and ask myself if I'm simply responding to unfamiliar diversity. And in so doing, I can choose to draw my circle a little wider. I'm also coming to resent the notion that anyone is divergent, as that implies there's something to be divergent from. Instead, I'm learning to appreciate and even love the diversity around me and how people look, how they think and sound, how they behave, and especially how they impact me. I always have the option to choose to embrace that diversity rather than just react to it, as I have done so often in my past. So indeed, Jay has been my teacher. I would be remiss this morning not to call our attention to the very reality that Jay and their husband Sean are the target of the rising tide of hate in our country. They, along with so many of our cherished UU members and our friends in the wider community, are at risk. Portland native and acclaimed playwright, novelist, and queer activist Claire Willett asks of us, quote, "For Pride Month this year, can straight people focus less on love is love and more on queer and trans people are in danger?" Certainly, we need to understand, celebrate, and love to draw our circles wider still. And we are called to protect our friends and neighbors whom others would deny their true colors, deny being their authentic selves, deny their wholeness. So now, if you will, please take a deep breath and let it out. And let us together create worship.
As I stand up here today, I want to tell you about the diversities of nature, not just among humans, but among all living beings. It's important that we learn to love that diversity and feel awe for it, not just because it's part of nature and the living reality of the goddess in all her finery, but also because it's in danger. And because it's in danger, so are we. As we know, the natural world and its diversities are being actively attacked in the modern world. The violence and harm we do is equivalent to war. We should stop this war. And we should shift towards an ethos of nonviolence towards all living beings. If we don't, and fast, we're in real trouble. We're winning the war, unfortunately. Populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and insects have dropped to less than a third of what they were 50 years ago. We could talk about some amazing truths about nature. Contemporary cosmology and biology point to vast diversities that entail numbers too vast to really conceive. I encourage you to seek out and explore information about contemporary biology, especially with its understanding of the way a diversity of forms, some of them truly weird and even uncomfortable by human standards, bring about the tremendous dance of life, which Walt Whitman has called the powerful play to which each being contributes a verse. Indeed, that's a really important type of spiritual exploration for Unitarian Universalists. As UUs, we affirm what we call 6 sources of the living tradition. These 6 sources are sources that we affirm as positive influences on our spirituality and that are common in our communities. Our non-exclusive list of 6 sources starts with an affirmation of the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. An openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Life doesn't turn away from what is. It looks to each thing as an example of what can be and finds ways to innovate each form, drawing the circle of existence wider and wider. There's no junk in nature. Nature seems to be something of a wild dancer with arms spread wide, spinning the fire of life and the sparks of creation as wide as she can. We're very used to certain plants and animals so that we don't think of them as unusual or spectacular in any way. Accustomed to their presence, we lose our sense of awe. But each living form is a profound undertaking, and there are so many kinds of living beings, even within species, that in the current ecological crisis, we're in danger of losing things we don't even know exist. What does it take to describe a flower? It takes poets and mathematicians and biologists and geneticists, ultimately cosmologists and philosophers and theologians. It takes so much knowledge and so many kinds of knowledge. The goddess of nature is also a goddess of wisdom, exploring endless possibilities. The National Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA, has a set of bylaws that include value statements. You can actually see these on the rows on the cover of your program here. Recently, part of these value statements were updated to read, interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life, and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. And we will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. The way we honor nature here sounds almost like Buddhism or her sister religion, Jainism. Not only are there vast varieties of forms of beings, but we covenant to protect them all from exploitation. We seek to act with care and respect, mutuality and justice. These are altogether an ethos of nonviolence, but a nonviolence that is curious also, that seeks to draw the circle of compassion and nonviolence as far as nature draws the circle of life. One that stands before nature in awe of its infinite varieties of form and humbles itself. Even just on our little earth, we see so very much, and we seek to love and act in love toward all of it, even when it gets weird. Ultimately, the integrity and wholeness of nature is our own wholeness and integrity, and the goal of nature is the life and well-being of all her children. What choices are you making that help to protect all life? As I stand up here, I want to tell you about the diversities of sex, gender, and sexuality, not just among humans, but among all living beings. It's important that we learn to love that diversity and feel awe for it, not just because it's part of nature and the living reality of the goddess in all her finery, but also because it's in danger. As we know, LGBTQ+ folks, among others, are being actively attacked in the current political climate, especially trans and non-binary folks like myself. I could tell you about some amazing men, women, and non-binary folks, fictional and non-fictional, and about their experiences with their sex and gender. But we'll save that for another time. You're probably already familiar with the stories of some folks who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but you may be less familiar with the stories of trans and non-binary folks. I encourage you to seek out and explore biographies of these incredible people, especially during this Pride Month that begins today. Indeed, that's really important for UUs, because as we've said, our 6 sources start with direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Neither life nor love turns away from what is. The ancient Hebrew, Jewish, and Christian traditions share a common understanding that their God is a God of excess, of whom we should be in awe, that God exceeds all of our language, and that God enjoys breaking down and playing with fixed categories. In fact, in the Bible, there is a tendency to think of God as primarily singular and male. But we also see that God had a divine female consort in some eras, sort of like Shiva and Shakti. And in other eras, that God's maleness is mixed with femininity. And that in some places still, God is even described as a nursing mother and having a womb. Jesus, too, in some European traditions, was considered so loving and so compassionate for all that she could only really be imagined as a woman. If we take the Bible as a whole, we see that God, described, isn't content to let God's self be described or appreciated in simple terms of any sort, certainly seldom any binary category, and definitely not simplistic gender binaries. In Islamic thought, it is often said that we call God He because He identifies Himself that way in the Quran. God gives us His pronouns, and it's important to honor them, He says. In these traditions, we also see that humans who draw near to divinity sometimes are described as having ambiguities of this sort. Moses is a mother who nurses, and in the Christian New Testament, we see Jesus and his followers challenging rigid, simplistic gender ideologies and embracing the realities of the complex sex and gender norms of the time. In this way, we see that goddess is rather like the Vulcans of Star Trek, who consider the motto infinite diversity in infinite combinations to be a foundational principle. Infinite diversity in infinite combinations. Fans of the show will know this as IDIC or IDIC, infinite diversity in infinite combinations. These traditions, Jewish and Christian, like Sufi traditions, hold that we should therefore approach the divine with humility and awe, with wonder at this excessive, extravagant divinity that as the divine creator and sustainer seeks to overcome our nothingness with joyful exuberance and an ecstatic creativity, who fills the darkness of our deep midwinters with the fullness of warm, tender love. She's like a mad Santa Claus who doesn't keep lists of who she likes and who she doesn't, who's naughty and who's nice. She gives endless goodwill toward all, drunk on the joy of a wildly generous spirit. She is a goddess of creation and creativity who revels in the love of her endlessly varied and gem-like creations. In Psalm 139, which some of you may know, we find this sentiment expressed well. The verses I have in mind speak firstly from our human perspective. Then secondly, imagine the divine perspective as an awareness of our primordial goodness, regardless of our form. And then finally recognize that our wholeness in relationship to the sacred comes out of abandoning our various concepts, fixations, and prejudices, and living in wonder at a world made in living, visionary love. The tradition we're talking about finds the sacred in authentic love, a love that exceeds expectations in its creativity, but which endlessly accommodates the boundless diversities of endlessly diverse forms. Psalm 139, 13-18 reads, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. That I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They're more than the sand. I come to the end, and I'm still with you." For those of you who read Rumi, the sentiments here will feel wonderfully familiar. What does it take to describe the forms of love? It takes poets and biologists and geneticists, ultimately mathematicians, cosmologists, and philosophers and theologians. It takes so much knowledge and so many kinds of knowledge. The goddess of nature is also a goddess of wisdom, exploring endless possibilities. What choices are you making that help to embody and protect such love? As I stand up here, I've spoken so far about natural diversity and the diversity of sex, gender, and sexuality. These two are part and parcel of the same thing, nature seeking out and exploring a wide variety of forms. I want to talk to you about one more kind of diversity, which is known as neurodiversity. This is the diversity of nervous systems we have among us as humans, with all their variety and their many forms. It's important that we learn to love that diversity and feel awe for it, not just because it's part of nature and the living reality of the goddess in all her finery, but also because it's in danger. As you may know, neurodivergent folks, that is, people with nervous systems that aren't typical, are being actively attacked in the current political climate, especially autistic folks like myself. You're probably familiar with a lot of autistic people, as we have contributed heavily to human civilization. Some people, like Socrates, Beethoven, and Kant, you may not realize were autistic, while others, like Einstein, Newton, Darwin, and Mozart, you may know. There are also others of note: Anthony Hopkins, Bobby Fischer, Dan Aykroyd, Bill Gates, Emily Dickinson. They're all examples. I encourage you to seek out and explore biographies of these remarkable people and of other neurodivergent individuals. The basic idea of neurodiversity is that nature is just as creative with human nervous systems as she is with the grand diversity of beings as a whole. The term neurodivergence means those nervous systems that in some way represent variations or differences in nervous systems that are not typical or normative. This turns out to be at least 1 in 5 people, possibly as many as 1 in 3. Neurodiversity as a concept is a big umbrella term which includes all forms of neurodivergence, not just autism. It also takes into account dyslexia, ADHD, Down syndrome, bipolar disorder, and intellectual giftedness, among others. Each of these comes with its own mix of traits and benefits, even though it may also come with problems. The idea of neurodiversity is not to be naive and say that different nervous systems don't come with problems. Even neurotypical nervous systems, the most common type, often come with problems. Instead, the idea is to reframe these problems in a new light, in the light of what we call the social disability model. We're used to thinking of the disabled as intrinsically so that we define them as people who cannot do certain things. The social disability model recognizes that disability is at least in part socially constructed. Let me give you an example. People with dyslexia are often defined by their inability to read or something like that. But when we look closely at the nervous systems of dyslexics, we discover that they process sensory information a bit differently. While this difference interferes with reading, it turns out to be an advantage for a hunter-forager lifestyle. As far as we know, the hunter-forager lifestyle has dominated human history, while reading is a relatively recent and rare activity. While it has become foundational to our lifestyle, literacy has not been foundational to our evolution until relatively recent times, as far as we know. It seems that those who are dyslexic are disabled in our culture, but are normative in others throughout history. Political commentator Tom Hartman, who you may know, has ADHD and is an outspoken advocate of a similar view for ADHD. Another example is what is known as justice sensitivity. In many folks who have autism, ADHD, and other forms of neurodivergence, there is seen to be a heightened sensitivity to matters of fairness, justice, and the like. The medical literature tends to see this as problematic, whereas I think in a context like our religion, someone with such sensitivities can thrive. We like being around people who see unfairness, injustice, and the like, and we especially like people who are moved to speak up and do something about it. Sure, it might be problematic, but it also might be good problematic. Justice sensitivity can lead to good trouble when accompanied by good moral companionship, such as our religion can provide. It does not have to be disabling in any sense. And what does it say about our culture that we see such things as potentially negative anyway? I think the neurodiversity model and the social disability model are extremely important. As an autistic person, of course, I find them empowering and liberating, but I also think they're liberating for us all, letting us see more of what is and what can be, feeling awe and wonder at the endless forms being explored by nature. And as we've stated, this is an important spiritual concern, since we take up the pledge to remove exploitation and injustice from all beings, and to honor the forces which create and uphold life. What does it take to describe a nervous system? Aren't all souls as worthy as a flower of consideration? It must take poets and mathematicians and biologists and geneticists, ultimately cosmologists and philosophers and theologians. It must take so much knowledge and so many kinds of knowledge. We have these, and it's still not enough to understand it all fully. As the psalm says, I come to the end, and I'm still with her. The goddess of nature is also a goddess of wisdom, exploring endless possibilities, drawing endless circles of life wider and wider still. What choices are you making that help to protect all lives? How big is the circle that your heart draws?